The sleek black Cadillac rolled silently into the parking lot of Grand Drive Motors, reflecting the soft morning sunlight of Los Angeles off its tinted windows. The fresh morning air carried a golden warmth, casting a gentle glow over the streets. In the driver's seat, Will Smith lowered the window slightly and took a deep breath. The warm scent of asphalt, a hint of coffee from the small cafe across the street, and the distant hum of the city all blended together in a quiet moment. His eyes settled on the modern office building in front of him, a place that now belonged to him after a successful acquisition. Owning a car dealership wasn't just an investment. It was a dream, a challenge, and a gateway into the business world he had longed to enter. But today he didn't want to walk in as the new owner. Before his employees knew who he wanted to experience this place firsthand, in the most authentic way possible. Inside the showroom, crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over the polished cars. The scent of new leather and freshly applied wax lingered in the air, mingling with the quiet murmurs of customers. At the reception desk, Rachel, a young receptionist, placed her coffee cup down and adjusted her brown hair. The morning had been like any other until her gaze drifted to the glass doors. A man walked in. He wore a black hoodie, faded jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. It was an outfit that didn't belong in a place like this. Rachel frowned. Another drifter? Or just someone with too much time on their hands? She was about to look away, but something made her pause. There was something unusual about him. He wasn't nervous or hesitant. He moved with an odd kind of confidence, unhurried, deliberate, as if he were inspecting every detail of the space. Across the showroom, Brian Carter, the store manager, was deep in conversation with a potential customer. His suit was impeccably pressed, his blonde hair neatly styled, and his smile was the perfect blend of charm and professionalism. But the moment he noticed the man in the hoodie, that smile disappeared. Leaning slightly toward the reception desk, he lowered his voice. "Rachel, call security." Rachel frowned. "But he hasn't done anything." Brian let out an impatient sigh. "Just look at him. He's not our kind of customer. I don't want some drifter making real clients uncomfortable." Rachel tightened her grip on her phone. For a second, she hesitated. The man didn't look like a vagrant. There was something different about him, something she couldn't quite put into words. Under the weight of Brian's stare, Rachel sighed softly and dialed security. Under the bright ceiling lights, the glossy black paint of the Mercedes-Benz S-Class reflected everything around it like a flawless mirror. The scent of premium leather mixed with the faint aroma of expensive cologne, enhancing the luxurious atmosphere of the showroom. Will Smith walked up slowly, his fingers gliding over the smooth surface of the car, feeling its polished finish beneath his touch. He paid no attention to the scrutinizing looks from the staff or the growing tension on Brian's face as he stood nearby. "Well, what exactly do you plan to do with that car?" A cold voice came from behind. Will turned around. It was Brian, arms crossed, eyes sharp with suspicion. "Just looking," Will replied with a calm smile, his tone unaffected by the hostility in the question. Brian smirked, folding his arms tighter. "Looking requires money. The cars here aren't for people who just want to stare." Will raised an eyebrow, his expression unchanged, but there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Oh, is that so?" Brian lifted his chin, voice firm. "If you're not planning to buy, you should leave." Will chuckled, shaking his head slightly, as if he had just heard something absurd. "What if I actually want to buy it?" Brian's eyes scanned Will's outfit, just a plain t-shirt, dark jeans, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. A look of mockery crossed his face. "Don't tell me you actually think you can afford it." Will crossed his arms, his gaze sharpening. "So, you judge customers based on how they look? That sounds like a brilliant sales strategy." Brian shrugged, his voice indifferent. "We have a way of telling who's a real buyer and who's just wasting our time." At that moment, a security guard arrived. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark blue uniform stepped up beside Brian, his sharp gaze locked onto Will. "Sir," the guard said, his voice polite but firm, "if you're not here to make a purchase, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Will glanced around. The other employees were watching closely. A few customers had started whispering, some shaking their heads, others smirking as if they had seen this scenario unfold too many times. Some guy with no money daring to touch something he could never own. He let out a slow breath, still calm, but now his voice carried a quiet authority. "I'll ask one more time. What if I actually want to buy it?" The room fell silent. Brian let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Look at yourself, man. Stop wasting our time." Will simply shook his head and shrugged. "All right, then." He turned and walked slowly toward the door. But just as his hand touched the handle, he stopped, glancing back at Brian. His eyes were eerily steady, as if he could already see what was coming. "You'll soon realize you just made a big mistake." Brian scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest, his eyes filled with contempt. "Yeah, sure." He waved his hand dismissively, brushing off the warning as if it were meaningless. What he didn't know was that in just a few hours those words would turn into a chillingly accurate prophecy. After Will left the dealership, Brian didn't give the incident another thought. To him, it was just another dull encounter. Some nobody trying to act important when, in reality, he was nothing. He carried on with his day, focusing on wealthy clients, the ones who actually mattered. But less than an hour later, a phone call from headquarters changed everything. The landline in Brian's office rang. With a sigh, he picked it up, making no effort to hide his disinterest. "Brian speaking." But instead of the usual voice of a subordinate, a deep, authoritative tone came through the receiver. "Brian, we need to talk, immediately." It was David Sinclair, the senior executive of Grand Drive Motors. A strange sense of unease crept into Brian's chest. He straightened in his chair, gripping the receiver a little tighter. "Yes, sir, I'm listening." On the other end, there was a long, unsettling silence, as if David was carefully choosing his words. Then, in a slow, deliberate voice, he said, "Are you aware that the new owner of the dealership visited this morning?" Brian froze. "The new owner?" "That's right," David said, his voice heavy. "Will Smith. He purchased the entire dealership network last week." The air suddenly felt thick. Brian's chest tightened. He could feel the pulse in his temple pounding, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk until they turned white. What? The events of the morning replayed in his mind like a film in reverse. The man in the faded hoodie, his calm demeanor as he was shown the door, and those final words he had spoken. "You'll soon realize you just made a big mistake." A cold sweat broke out on Brian's palms. His throat went dry. He stammered, "Sir, did you say Will Smith?" "You mean the Will Smith? The actor?" David, sounding impatient, shot back, "How many Will Smiths do you think there are?" Brian felt the blood drain from his face. His grip on the phone tightened, his breathing suddenly unsteady. But, but he looked like a homeless guy. David's voice turned razor sharp. "And you threw him out." Brian opened his mouth to explain, but no words came out. "Sir, I didn't know. How was I supposed to recognize him?" David's tone was ice cold. "I don't care." He paused for a brief moment, then delivered the final blow. "Will Smith is your boss now, and I'm not sure how much longer you'll be keeping your job." Brian slowly lowered the phone, his hands trembling. At the reception desk, Rachel frowned, noticing his pale face. "Boss, what's wrong?" Brian stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and horror, as if he himself couldn't believe what had just happened. His voice came out dry, barely above a whisper. "Rachel, the man we just kicked out was Will Smith." Rachel's breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the desk as the weight of his words sank in. You mean the Will Smith? The actor Will Smith? Brian nodded, his face pale as if every drop of blood had been drained from his body. The entire showroom felt like it had frozen in time. The usual sounds of typing and quiet conversations had vanished. A barista pouring coffee stopped mid-motion, staring toward Brian. Somewhere, a pen dropped, the tiny clatter echoing like a gunshot in the eerie silence. Panic spread like wildfire. Everyone knew this wasn't just a mistake, it was the kind of blunder that could trigger a massive shakeup. Brian fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed. He needed to contact Will Smith immediately. But as he scrolled frantically through his contacts, an even more terrifying realization hit him. Will Smith had never left a number. The panic in Brian's chest swelled to a breaking point. He paced back and forth in his office, his breathing heavy. The phone in his hand felt scorching hot, but no matter who he called, no one had any answers. Rachel stood nearby, staring blankly at her computer screen, not really seeing anything. Employees whispered among themselves, but no one dared speak too loudly. They all understood the gravity of the situation. If Will Smith was truly angry, it wouldn't just be Brian in trouble. The entire dealership could be facing an unforgiving reckoning. But the most terrifying part wasn't an angry phone call. It wasn't a harsh email from corporate. It was the silence. No response, no complaints, no emails, no texts, nothing. Not because Will Smith wasn't upset, but because he was waiting. Brian felt every muscle in his body tighten, a cold shiver running down his spine. There was only one thought left in his mind. He's not reacting right away. That means he's thinking, or worse, planning. A plan I won't see coming until it's too late. His heart pounded violently in his chest. A storm was coming. The sun sank lower, bathing the skyline in fiery orange hues. The city was winding down, but then a deep, rumbling engine shattered the quiet. A sleek black Rolls-Royce Cullinan glided to a stop right in front of the dealership. Inside the showroom, every conversation came to an abrupt halt. Laughter died mid-sentence. Without needing to be told, every employee turned to look toward the glass entrance. A few exchanged confused glances. A car like this didn't just show up unannounced, especially not a Rolls-Royce. Brian sat slumped in his chair, his eyes drifting unfocused over his computer screen. But something outside shifted. The murmurs faded. A heavy silence settled over the showroom. A sharp wave of unease crashed through Brian's gut. He leaned forward, glancing out the window. His coworkers stood frozen, their wide-eyed stares fixed on the front doors. Then Brian saw him. Stepping out of the Rolls-Royce was Will Smith. That man had worn a faded hoodie and old jeans. The man standing before them now was someone entirely different. A perfectly tailored navy blue suit hugged his frame, crisp and flawless. Dark designer sunglasses reflected the bright showroom lights. It wasn't just the clothes that had changed. It was the presence, confidence, control, authority. Will Smith exuded a quiet dominance that sucked the air from the room. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Everyone could feel it. And in that moment, Brian knew this wasn't going to end well for him. What made Brian the most uneasy was Will's gaze, sharp, calm, but carrying something unreadable. The entire showroom was suffocatingly silent. Every employee stood frozen, their eyes locked on the powerful man who was steadily making his way inside. Will Smith didn't glance at anyone. He walked straight to the reception desk. Planting both hands on the counter, he leaned slightly toward Rachel. "Hello, young lady," he said, his deep voice smooth yet commanding. "Tell me, anything interesting happen here today?" Rachel swallowed hard, her fingers instinctively tightening around the paper in her hand. Uh, good afternoon, Mr. Smith," she stammered, her voice unsteady. Brian took a deep breath, forcing himself to regain composure before stepping forward. Mr. Smith, I want to sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding this morning, he said quickly, trying to maintain a professional smile. Will slowly removed his sunglasses, his sharp eyes scanning Brian from head to toe, as if deciding whether he was even worth speaking to. Misunderstanding? Will arched an eyebrow, his voice calm but laced with pressure. You think what happened this morning was just a misunderstanding? The tension in the room thickened. Brian felt his breath quicken. A cold bead of sweat trickled down his spine, but he didn't dare wipe it away. I I truly didn't recognize you, sir, he said hastily. If I had known you were the owner, I would never what? Will cut him off, a faint, humorless smile flickering across his lips. Never thrown me out. Brian froze. Will's expression remained unreadable. So, if I wasn't the owner, you would have treated me the same way, right? Brian opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Because Will was right. Will gave a slow nod, his eyes darkening. Do you know what bothers me the most? He asked. Brian shook his head, his throat dry. Will looked him straight in the eye, his voice deep and razor sharp. The way you judge customers based solely on appearance. The silence in the showroom was deafening. Some employees lowered their gazes as if afraid Will's scrutiny would turn on them next. I walked in here wearing ordinary clothes, Will continued, his tone measured, and you immediately assumed I couldn't afford a car. No greeting, no questions. You simply dismissed me. Slowly, Will let his gaze sweep across the showroom, his piercing eyes landing on each and every employee. How many other customers have been treated the same way? The silence stretched, heavy as stone. A few employees swallowed nervously, but no one dared to speak. But that very silence said everything. Will took slow, deliberate steps toward Brian, his gaze cutting like a blade. His voice dropped lower, each word carving into the thick air. Do you know why I bought this dealership? Brian swallowed hard, his spine cold with tension. I don't, sir. Will didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied Brian, as if deciding whether he was even worth an explanation. Then, at last, he spoke. I didn't buy this dealership just to make money. His voice was steady, firm. I bought it to change the way people like you treat customers. His words landed like a thunderclap in the heavy silence. A few employees held their breath. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Will inhaled deeply, then delivered the final blow. And I don't think you belong here. A chill ran down Brian's spine. His heart pounded against his ribs. You're firing me? His voice wavered, barely believing what he had just heard. Will crossed his arms, his eyes locked onto Brian. What do you think I should do? Sweat trickled down Brian's forehead, sliding down his temple. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to find some excuse. But in this moment, he knew it was pointless. One mistake that morning, and now everything was slipping from his grasp. Power, position, reputation. All of it crumbling like sand slipping through his fingers. Taking a deep breath, Brian forced himself to stay composed. Around him, the eyes of his colleagues were watching, some with sympathy, others indifferent. A few even looked relieved. He clenched his fists, then slowly spoke. I'll accept your decision. His voice was steadier now. But I will prove that I can do better. For a moment, something flickered in Will's expression, not quite sympathy, but no longer the icy detachment from before. He gave a slow nod. Good, I'll be watching. Then Will turned, facing the rest of the employees who had been frozen in silence. Some were still tense. Others looked like a weight had just been lifted. His gaze swept over each person, his voice calm yet commanding. I want every single one of you to understand something. He let the words settle before continuing. From today forward, every customer who walks through those doors will be treated with absolute respect. No judgments based on clothes, status, or appearance. Anyone can be a customer. Anyone can be important. No one objected. A few employees nodded. Others straightened their backs, as if awakening from a long-standing bad habit. Will let the silence stretch, scanning the room to ensure his message had sunk in. Then, unexpectedly, he smirked. "All right," he said, his voice lighter. "Now, someone show me the best cars you've got. I am still looking to buy one." For a moment there was silence, then laughter broke out, shattering the tension. It was just a joke, but it was enough to cut through the heaviness in the air. The weight of uncertainty lifted, replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. Brian took a step back, watching it all unfold. He wasn't the one in charge anymore, but as he stood there, a new thought took root. This failure isn't the end. Maybe it was a new beginning. And just like that, a new chapter of Grand Drive Motors began. Not just about luxury cars, but about trust, transformation, and people willing to do what was right,